This story is about two men who were frozen many years ago. But one day, when they are brought back to life, they discover that all men in the world have disappeared. Everywhere, there are only women, and these two men are the only ones left among them. The story begins in the year 1991. Here, we see a press conference being held about the first human hibernation of the century. Two men, Max and Albert, volunteer for the experiment. We also see a professor who designed this machine. The professor explains to everyone that their experiment has been successful. They had kept a chimpanzee in this chamber for 6 months, and during that time, the chimpanzee's age did not increase at all. Moreover, the chimpanzee is still completely healthy. Therefore, the professor now wants to use humans for his next experiment. Max and Albert volunteer to enter the machine for 3 years, even though the professor warns that it is very risky. He explains that the human body is different from that of a chimpanzee, so complications could arise. Despite the risks, Max and Albert agree to proceed. The machine is activated, and Max and Albert enter it. Slowly, time passes, and 50 years go by in the blink of an eye. Finally, the machine is opened, and Max and Albert are brought out. They find that their ages have not increased at all, they are the same as they were when they went in. Hungry after waking up, they are served food by some women. However, since they haven't eaten in years, they've forgotten the taste of food. Max recalls that he had hidden a bottle of alcohol and some cigarettes in the machine. Excitedly, they retrieve the items and begin smoking. As soon as the smoke spreads, alarms start blaring everywhere. Everyone panics, thinking something has gone wrong. Two women arrive to extinguish the fire, and shortly after, a woman named Dr. Blunt arrives and informs them that the professor has passed away. Shocked, the two men listen as Dr. Blunt explains that a great war occurred during their hibernation, during which all men on Earth were killed. Only women survived, and these two men were spared because they were inside the machine. Hearing this, the two men are overwhelmed and try to escape. However, when they touch the door, they receive an electric shock and fall to the ground. Albert starts wondering and says to Max, "Could it be true that we've been inside the machine for 50 years? Max agrees, adding, "If there are no men left, how is the next generation continuing?" Dr. Blunt overhears their conversation and explains that children are now created through machines. This revelation shocks them further. Meanwhile, another woman, Maria, approaches Dr. Blunt and advises her to inform the others about her research. She warns her not to conduct experiments on the men in secrecy. Later, Max and Albert notice a TV turning on in their room. A child appears on the screen, speaking, which leads Max to deduce that the children are being created using test tubes. Saddened by this, Max remarks, "How can they do this to the children?" Albert replies, "A lot has changed over the past 50 years. These women don't even need to become pregnant to have children anymore." The two men drink and become emotional. The next morning, they wake up to find Dr. Blunt in their room, asking how they feel. Max jokingly says, "Everything's fine, but it would have been better if you'd gotten intimate with me." Dr. Blunt gets angry and throws him to the ground. Witnessing this, Albert warns Max to avoid making inappropriate remarks. Later, Dr. Blunt brings some guards and explains to the men that radiation has spread across the world. If anyone goes outside, they will die from the radiation. She shows them an animal that had died due to exposure. They inspect more animals and soon meet their leader, who reveals that the professor's machine was responsible for wiping out all the men. Shocked, Albert suggests they could help repopulate the Earth by being intimate with the women. This angers the leader, who refers to a biblical story about an apple causing chaos and accuses them of wanting to start trouble. She orders the guards to lock them up. Inside their room, Max breaks down, and Albert reassures him, saying they'll find a way out. Meanwhile, Dr. Blunt begins wondering what intimacy feels like. Seeking answers, she approaches the eldest woman and asks her about it. The woman explains that intimacy is when two people who love each other come together, and through this, they can create a child. Later, Max and Albert are taken to a lab where experiments are conducted. The women attempt to get them to sign consent forms for experiments on their bodies, but they refuse. The situation escalates as the women gather to decide their fate. Max and Albert use the chaos to escape, eventually finding an underground passage. On their way, they discover alcohol and an old newspaper that reveals a major disaster in 2013 that killed all the men. Guards pursue them, but they evade capture by joining a group of rebellious women who oppose the leader's rules. After further adventures, they discover that the radiation story was a lie created by the leader, who turns out to be a man disguised as a woman. He explains that years ago, he had to hide his identity to survive. The story ends with Max and Dr. Blunt forming a romantic bond. Albert and the other women work together to alter the formula used for creating children, ensuring that future generations include men. The next generation sees the birth of a boy, marking a new beginning. The story concludes here.